Welcome. We are so glad that you're here to help us celebrate the 30th anniversary of Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics. I'm going to reserve my fuller thoughts on the past, present, and future of the center for tomorrow's celebrations. So for now, I'm just going to take a few brief moments to ruminate on where we are. These days, when I go around the world and answer the question of what I do by saying that I'm the director of an ethics center, people generally raise an eyebrow and chortle. I'm sure you've all heard that sort of half laugh when you say, yeah, I work with an ethics center. And they say, you're not going to be out of business anytime soon. And they say things like, well, that must be a pretty new enterprise. And I say, well, actually, we've been doing it for 30 years. And then they say, you sort of look crestfallen, and they say, oh, gosh, I'm sorry. Things aren't looking very good for you for the outcomes. 30 years of effort, and here's where we find ourselves. I never quite have the heart to sort of raise the pesky, problematic counterfactual and to ask them to imagine what the world would be like if we hadn't been doing all of this work for 30 years. So all that said, it's clear that the world's in a pretty fragile state, that the prospects are widely variable for justice, human flourishing, and the sound application of practical ethics in our daily personal and communal lives. It's equally clear that many of our leading social institutions suffer from legitimacy crises. Corporations, Congress, and the European Union, the UN and global news media, even new institutions like Facebook. Much has changed in the 30 years since Harvard's then president, Derek Bok, and political and moral philosopher Dennis Thompson charted a course for a brand new center in ethics and the professions, as it was first called. Thank you, Dennis, for being here this evening. In the center's annual reports, you can catch early glimmers of some of the powerful social phenomena that have come over time to make our work, I think, increasingly difficult. So in Dennis's 1988-89 annual report to President Bok, he included this small note, almost as an afterthought. Despite my best efforts, the program is still in the news. Naturally, I do not mind when the Chronicle of Higher Education sees fit in a thoughtful piece on research being done in the program to praise our pioneering efforts, when the Christian Science Monitor features the program in a favorable full-page story in its ideas section, or when the Cambridge Forum gives me a full half hour on national radio to answer questions about the purposes of the program. But I am less pleased when cable network news, Dennis didn't know the name quite yet, runs a series of 5-minute programs, one day for a week, on ethics education that reduces our efforts to what might be called ethics bites. Viewers got to hear from you, President Bok that is, me and others making disjointed comments about the importance of ethics while they watched, among other sites, teenage couples making out during lunch hour on the campus of a Southern California high school. I was actually in high school in Southern California that year, so I had to wonder. But anyway, but Dennis's note, in effect, contains an early warning alert of the massive change to our communications ecosystem that was about to wash over us and transform our public discourse. Without knowing it, perhaps, he heralded the shift we have all now lived through, from a public culture supportive of thoughtful, long-form, and reflective dialogue to one in which ethics bites often seem like the best we can do. From the beginning, the center recognized the need to encourage more and better understanding of the ethical issues in public life. As Dennis has written, we believe that all students, and for that matter all citizens, could benefit from reflecting more carefully and discussing more civilly the moral quandaries of our time. We believe philosophical reflection in this broad sense could help. Often when we talk about the work of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics, we focus on the words philosophy, or ethics, or practical ethics. But in this comment from Dennis, I think the most important word may well be reflection. We have within the university continued to preserve the space, time, and habits needed for reflection. But how much of that is still available outside of our quads? Over the course of our 2.5-day celebration of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics, we'll enjoy a movable feast of reflection, progressing through the many different modes this activity can take. We began this morning with a wonderful, intimate seminar with prepared papers on the theme of perspectives on Chinese thought in the world. Tomorrow, we'll spend the day in dialogic, armchair discussions on important themes, ethics in the end of life, preparing for public office, the question of the engaged university. And on Saturday, we'll break up into smaller groups for broad participatory discussion of core themes in contemporary work and practical ethics: climate change and sustainability, institutional corruption, and economic ordeals. For this evening's course in our movable feast, we have a formal lecture. We will once again exercise our cognitive muscles by following the precise steps of a philosophical argument over the course of 50 minutes. Delectable for all of us. Each of these formats reflects a millennia of cultivating human practices to support reflection. The space and time these practices open up for exploration, testing, honest exchange, and mutual improvement are the antithesis of what is now delivered 24/7 on CNN and its peers. Yet this televisual world has come to dominate our shared life, and in the US provides the majority of our fellow residents with their routine intellectual fare. Here at Harvard, we get a feast. Many, if not most of our fellow citizens, too often are offered the mind's equivalent of airline food. As we celebrate 30 years of securing space for genuine, deep, prolonged reflection on hard ethical questions, of preparing the feast we'll all enjoy over these coming 2.5 days, we should also consider how we might secure anew, outside of our own advantaged precincts, the space, time, and practices needed for reflection. But tonight, it's our privilege to undertake together, once more and in shared space, the adventure of ethical reflection, this time under the capable guidance of Cécile Fabre, one of the most distinguished political philosophers of our day. Cécile is a senior research fellow at All Souls College, Oxford, and professor of political philosophy at the University of Oxford, as well as a fellow of the British Academy. She's the author of 5 books and numerous articles on topics of distributive justice, democracy, and the rights we have over our own body. She's just completed a 2-volume project on the ethics of war and peace. Volume 1, Cosmopolitan War. Volume 2, Cosmopolitan Peace, the second one out in 2016. She's currently working on the ethics of economic statecraft for Harvard University Press. From 1989 to 1992, she was at the Sorbonne, where she earned her BA. She then did an MA at the University of York, and then a PhD in politics under the supervision of Jerry Cohen at Oxford. In Cécile's work, you'll see another very fine mind at work, careful and imaginative simultaneously, but she's distinguished herself by charting her own course and a research agenda defined by her own focal concern with war. Tonight, she'll invite us to reflect on the subject of espionage in war, offering her lecture under the title, In Defense of Spies. Cécile.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Allen, for those extremely kind remarks. I won't be able to carry on with a food metaphor, for 50 minutes. It's not my first visit to Harvard. I have been here before, but never to give a talk, as it happens. And I have to say that I feel particularly privileged, honored, and humbled to be able to do so on the occasion of this wonderful anniversary conference this afternoon. Now, you may wonder why I chose to address you tonight on the topic of espionage. One personal autobiographical reason is that I just love the stuff. I love a good spy novel or a good spy movie, and it's always more interesting to reflect on things that one loves. That's my first reason for talking to you about this tonight. But of course, I am not losing sight of the fact that the Center is celebrated here for its contribution to ethics and public life. And as it happens, it seems to me that thinking about espionage is, or at least should be, an important facet of our thinking about public life, if only because most governments, perhaps indeed all governments of the world, spend considerable amounts of resources, both human and financial, on funding security and intelligence services. The budgets run into the billions of dollars. Equally importantly, if not perhaps more importantly, in our name, on our behalf and at our behest, sometimes our governments, via the intelligence and security services, order individual agents, the spies, to commit acts which in many instances would strike us at first sight as morally dubious. And for that reason too, it seems to me that we need to think about that which tends to operate perhaps by definition in the shadows must be brought out into the light so that we have perhaps a better sense of what it is that is being done, again, to repeat, in our name, on our behalf, and sometimes at least at our behest. Now, as Professor Allen mentioned in her remarks, I have for a number of years now thought quite a bit and written too about the ethics of war. And so the topic of my lecture today is not espionage tout court, it is espionage in the context of war. Now, just war theory has a very long pedigree. One could argue that one of its most important questions is the two-pronged question of when, if ever, we are morally permitted or indeed sometimes obliged, to go to war, and once we are at war, who may be killed permissibly during the war. These are the perennial, questions in just war, theory. Now, as you know, the field has witnessed an enormous regrowth in the last 15 years or so, thanks to the extraordinary works by, amongst others, Jeff McMahon, Seth Lazar, David Rodin, and Francis Cam, of course, who is here with us this evening. And in that literature, one discerns an emerging question, namely, under conditions of epistemic uncertainty, given that more often than not, belligerents simply do not know whether they have a just cause, whether their war would be a proportionate response to the injury which they claim they have suffered, indeed whether or not the war is the option of last resort. Given, moreover, that individual soldiers, once the war has started, more often than not, are not in a particularly good epistemic position with respect to discerning whether or not the targets which they have in their sight is indeed a legitimate target. Under those conditions of epistemic uncertainty, what may, indeed must, belligerents and individual soldiers do? Now, I think it's a profoundly important question. My focus today, however, is on a slightly different epistemic dimension of war, namely what it is that belligerents may indeed do as a means to dispel the fog of war, as a means to improve the epistemic situation. To put it in a more direct and simple way, are belligerents morally entitled to resort to espionage as a means to procure information about the enemy, which of course the enemy would much rather be kept secret? And I shall argue, these are my two key claims on the handout. By the way, do you all have? Good, excellent. My key claims, which are listed on the handout, are the following. Wartime espionage is morally justified, indeed obligatory, as a means to serve just war ends and as a means to minimize occurrences on which soldiers will act unjustly. And by espionage, I mean the act, or some people would say the art or practice of surreptitiously procuring information about the enemy, which the latter wishes to keep secret. I shall also argue more briefly, however, that treason as a means of spying is sometimes morally justified. Now, I should say a little bit more about the context against which the talk will unfold. Just war theory, I mentioned earlier, is voluminous. So, in fact, is the body of scholarship which scrutinizes the laws of war. There is actually relatively little in those twin bodies of literature about espionage. We could speculate together as to why that might be the case. I find it, slightly odd. In any event, what there is tells us the following, that in law, spies do not get the privileges of combatants insofar as they do not wear the uniform and are not incorporated into the state's armed forces. To put it non-philosophically, they do get a pretty rough deal. In fact, in some jurisdictions, being found out as a spy, will cut you off to the death penalty, as it were. In just war theory, one finds, both in contemporary just war theory on the one hand, but in the history of the tradition, on the other hand, one finds references, to spies as follows. Hobbes, for example, tells us in De Cive that the prince must use spies as a means to procure information about the enemy. Vattel, the great jurist of the 18th century, has interesting things to say about treason, which is partly why I want to talk about treason. Kant is at his, how shall I put it, his vituperative best, when he describes espionage as, quote, that infernal art, unquote, and that's because he has worries about lying, deception, and so on and so forth. In the contemporary strand of the literature on the just war, which deals with espionage, one finds the following view as the dominant view, namely that once the war has started, spies are morally on a par vis-à-vis one another. Spies operate within a set of rules of which they are cognizant, and what they do within those rules is not in any way shaped, as it were, by the moral status of the war which they are serving, and I will in fact argue against that view. So, this is the context of the talk. I do need to make some preliminary points before getting on with the argument proper. That's preliminaries on your handout. First, a point of terminology. I will often in the talk use the phrase just belligerent, or indeed unjust belligerent. A just belligerent, on my account, is a belligerent who fights for a just cause and does so justly. An unjust belligerent is a belligerent who fights for an unjust cause or who fights unjustly. And here I have in mind the standard requirements of the just war, that it should have a just cause, be the option of last resort, stand a reasonable chance of success, be a proportionate response to the injustice suffered, and abide by the principle of discrimination. I operate against a background assumption which I need to spell out a little bit. Now, on the view that I endorse, which some people call the neoclassical account of the ethics of harming in war, individuals are morally justified in harming other agents in war only if, on the grounds that, they have a just cause for so doing, and so long as the acts of harming satisfy the aforementioned requirements. Now, the thought here is this, that on that neoclassical account, whether or not the cause is just has a crucially important bearing on the moral status of individual combatants' acts of killing. Now, I know that that claim will be familiar to some of you in the room, but perhaps not to all of you. So let me illustrate by way of an example. In 2003, March of that year, a US-led military coalition invaded Iraq. Many people at the time argued, and in fact still do argue now, that this war was a war of aggression, indeed was an unlawful war of aggression, but more strongly still was an unjust war, precisely because there was no just cause. Now, on an orthodox view of the just war, once the war had been declared by the coalition, and once the coalition troops had entered Iraq, coalition soldiers and Iraqi soldiers were morally on a par vis-à-vis one another. That is to say, even though ex hypothesi, coalition soldiers were killing Iraqi soldiers in the service of an unjust cause, they were morally entitled to do so in exactly the same way and to the same degree as Iraqi soldiers were entitled to kill coalition soldiers, even though they, the Iraqi soldiers, were acting in prosecution of an unjust cause. That view is sometimes described in the literature as the thesis of moral equality between combatants. I disagree with that thesis. A number of us do disagree with it. On the view that I espouse here, and which I will not defend this afternoon, the fact that by hypothesis coalition soldiers were killing Iraqi soldiers in support of an unjust cause, whereas Iraqi soldiers by hypothesis were killing coalition soldiers in prosecution of a just cause, has a decisive normative bearing on their respective acts of killing. To put it roughly, on that view, coalition soldiers were not morally entitled to kill Iraqi soldiers in their and their comrades' defense precisely because they were acting in persecution of an unjust cause. By contrast, Iraqi soldiers were entitled, this is roughly put, but were entitled to kill their enemies. And so one way to construct or to frame my question this afternoon, is the following. If this is true, if it is true that the moral status of the cause for which soldiers fight has a decisive bearing on their individual acts of killing, does it follow that the moral status of spies, individual acts of spying, is shaped by the moral status of the cause for which they fight? And I will argue that actually our views about spying should be more nuanced, perhaps for some reasons that I will go through later, than our views about killing. Now, I want you to bear 3 points in mind. First, I will postulate that contribution to unjustified threats causes agents to lose their right not to be killed and to become legitimate targets. And this means, second, that under some circumstances, civilian contributors can count as legitimate targets insofar as they too make a contribution to an unjust war. And the paradigmatic example of the civilians are munitions factory workers, and I will return to that case later on. Finally, I endorse here what some people following Derek Parfit call a fact-relative account of justifiability, whereby I am justified in harming you in self or other defense if the facts are such that you are subjecting me or someone else to a wrongful threat of harm. By contrast, if you are not subjecting me or someone else to a wrongful threat of harm, I am not justified in harming you in self or other defense. For so are the facts, irrespective of my beliefs and the evidence at my disposal. Now, we have the building blocks that we need in order to start thinking about espionage, and I want to make a first pass at the issue by distinguishing, at first in a somewhat rough and ready way, just from unjust spies. Now, it seems to me that a defense of espionage must defend two separate claims. First, the claim that acquiring military information about the enemy, which the enemy would rather that we not acquire, is itself justified. Second, acquiring such information by the means which spies standardly employ, such as deception, manipulation, blackmail, treason, is justified. These are two separate claims and they must be accordingly treated separately. So I will begin with the first, in defense of acquiring in a military information. I think it's fairly uncontroversial that in peacetime members of a political community have prima facie entitlements over political, economic and military information which concerns their community, or indeed concerns them, qua members of this community, and which they have not knowingly and deliberately placed in the public domain. Privacy, property rights, national security, and political agency ground this claim. The point I'm making here is relatively familiar, but it has been defended superbly, I think, in works by Dennis Thompson and also Cécile Fabre. So it's a particular pleasure for me that they should be here tonight as well. Let's take this for granted. At least in peacetime, there are certain kinds of information that we together as members of the political community have an entitlement that outsiders not seek to appropriate without our consent. Even if this is true, in conflictual situations, in conflictual situations, this changes. If you attempt to kill me without just cause, not only am I morally justified in killing you as a matter of last resort, but I'm also entitled to find out how many guns you have at your disposal in order the better to tailor my retaliatory, defensive steps against you. This surely is not privileged information from your point of view. Rather, it is not information that you have a claim against me that I should regard as privileged, and likewise with war, it seems to me. Imagine that two communities, blue and red, are at war. Red have unwarrantedly, unjustly aggressed blue, surely they are not entitled that blue should regard information about their, that is to say, red's military capabilities, as privileged. Conversely, collecting intelligence in prosecution of an unjust war, or indeed unjust acts within an otherwise just war, is morally wrong in and of itself, irrespective of the means by which it is done. Have you seen the movie The Departed by Martin Scorsese? So that's the domestic analogy which I have in mind. Scorsese asks us to imagine a mafia gang on the one hand, which has successfully placed an undercover member amongst the police force, and you will have guessed what happens. The police force have their own undercover officer in the mafia gang. Now, under certain stipulated conditions, we might be drawn to the view that the mafia lack a claim that the police not try to get the information which the police needs in order to successfully fight the mafia. But we might think conversely that the police certainly have a claim that the mafia not try to do the same to them. And likewise, it seems to me, modulo certain qualifications which I won't get to here in the case of war. So that's a first step towards ascertaining that there is some degree of asymmetry between the intelligence services of communities at war, a symmetry which flows from, as it were, the moral status of their respective wars. Just belligerents, in other words, are clearly entitled to spy on their enemy in service of their just war. Unjust belligerents are not entitled to spy on their enemy in service of an unjust war. Now, I want to claim now, Section 4, that just belligerents are not merely entitled to spy, they are under a duty to do so, and not merely to their own forces and members, but to enemy members as well, Section 4 on your handout. They are under a duty to do so not merely if or to the extent that they are under a duty to go to war. If they are under a duty to go to war, and if acquiring military intelligence spying on their enemy is a necessary means of fulfilling their duty, well, then they are under a duty to spy. But even if they are merely justified in going to war and not under a duty to do so, then they are under a duty to spy, at least a pretendo in a duty. Suppose once more that red mounts an unwarranted and lethal military aggression on blue. Blue have a just cause, but they need to ascertain whether the war, if they were to fight it, would breach the aforementioned requirements of proportionality, discrimination, and so on and so forth. Now, insofar as they are under a duty to comply with those requirements, they are under a duty to procure the relevant information, the information that they need to have at their disposal in order to ascertain whether, by going to war, they would act in compliance with the requirements of the just war. Now, the claim that they are under a duty to do so to their fellow members is relatively uncontroversial. So what I want to do instead is try and show why we might think that just belligerents are under a duty to enemy members to ascertain, through spying if necessary, pretendo, duty at any rate, whether or not they may go to war. And so I would like us to think about a case which I call factory on the handout. Let us suppose that blue have patchy information from one source to the effect that red have set up a weapons factory within range of blue troops. But they also have contradictory information from another source to the effect that the site is in fact a baby food in a factory. Only spies on the grounds can help blue ascertain what the site actually is. Now, suppose that in fact the site is a baby food factory. If that's the case, blue are not justified in deliberately bombing it, killing the workers inside. I'm assuming, I hope you can follow me with this, but I'm assuming for the sake of argument that manufacturers of baby food are not legitimate targets in war. If the blues proceed without sending their spies out to check, even though they are in a position to do so, not only would they violate the requirement of discrimination, but they would do so unnecessarily. Unjustifiably killing someone is a very serious wrong to that person. Unjustifiably killing them when one was in a position not to do so is far worse, it seems to me. But suppose now, case 2, that the site is a weapons factory. Remember what I said earlier, that sometimes, civilians who contribute to an unjust war, munitions factory workers being a paradigmatic example of those civilians, are legitimate targets in war. So in this particular case, if the site is a weapons factory, Blue are justified in deliberately bombing it, killing the workers inside, at least portento. Now, we might think that it is odd to say that Blue owe it to those agents to spy on them to ensure that they are legitimate targets, for after all, by hypothesis, those agents are not morally justified in contributing to Red's unjust war against Blue, and they are legitimate targets. So if they are legitimate targets anyway, why would it matter, whether Blue proceeds to kill them without having checked first? Well, I think it really does matter. For if Blue proceed without bombing, they would commit a morally risky act. And it seems to me that subjecting others to what one knows is a risk of harm without checking whether one is harming them justifiably, as warranted by the facts, and when one could check, is wrongful insofar as it attests to callous indifference towards, and thus fundamental lack of respect for those individuals. So this concludes, the argument, to the effect that just belligerents are not merely justified in spying on their enemy as a means to ascertain whether they would act in compliance with the requirements of the just war. They are under a duty to do so. But what about unjust belligerents now? Section 5 on your handout. Remember, by hypothesis, Red are fighting an unjust war. They are not entitled to spy as a means to facilitate their unjust war making. It does not follow, however, that they are never entitled to spy on Blue. On the contrary, I want to suggest now that they are under a duty to do so as a means to minimize the occurrences on which their soldiers will act unjustly. So let's go back to factory star this time. And let's change the case as follows. This time it's Red who have patchy information to the effect that Blue have set up a weapons factory within range of Red's troops, but they have contradictory information to the effect that the site in fact is a baby food factory, and only spies on the grounds can help Red ascertain what the site is. Case 1, we run the argument again. The site is a baby food factory. Now, if the spies go out and check, they will tell their masters that the site is a baby food factory, and in this case, Red will not bomb. Suppose that Red do not send their spies out, though they could. They bombed the site, killing all inside. Have they wronged the workers? Well, yes, by virtue of the same set of reasons which I articulated earlier when looking at Blue's duty to spy in this particular case. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Suppose now, and I have to say I'm slightly torn on what I'm about to say now, so I'm going to need your help to come to grips with this. So this is the bit where it gets interesting. So suppose that the site is a weapons factory. If Red spies go out to check, they will go back to Red and say it's a weapons factory. Red will bomb the site, killing all inside. Now remember, ex hypothesi, Red are fighting an unjust war, Blue are fighting a just war. Ex hypothesi, if what I've said before about contributions to unjust threats being a necessary condition for being a legitimate target, those Blue factory workers are not legitimate targets. They ought not to be killed. Red ought not to proceed with the bombing. Red decide not to send their spies out. They bomb the site, killing all inside. Now here's the question. Do they wrong the factory workers by failing to check? And now this is why I'm torn, because on the one hand I want to say, well, actually no, from the point of view of those workers, the wrong that is done to them is the fact that they were killed without proper justification. It seems not to matter that Red's leadership failed to check that by their own lights, which happened to be unwarranted or mistaken in this case, these people were legitimate targets. To put the point differently, it seems to mischaracterize the wrong that is done to those people by saying, God, it's terrible. Red didn't even check. Well, I want to say, well, it doesn't really matter. That's not what their grievance is. Their grievance is that they were killed when they ought not to have been killed anyway, whether Red had checked or not. Now, the reason I'm torn here, and I didn't add that on the handout, and I should have, the reason I'm torn here is because, some people might be drawn to the view, and I'm drawn to the view that actually you do a wrong, to someone if you fail to check that even by your lights, that they are, legitimate targets. You don't even bother, to acquire, the relevant information. At any rate, maybe you don't do a wrong to those individuals, but you might argue that there is an impersonal wrongdoing, that has been committed, here, that we owe it generally, or we have strong moral reasons generally, to check that we take harming decisions, on the basis of reasons which we take as our own. There are counterexamples, to this, which we can talk about in the other discussion later on. But I want to say that to the extent that by spying, the Reds would reduce the occurrences on which their forces would commit unjustifiable acts of killing, for example, by checking that the site is a baby food factory, they are under a second best duty to do so. Their first best duty is to stop fighting. But if they are not going to stop fighting, then their second best obligation is to repeat, to minimize the occurrences on which their forces will commit unjust acts. And if they need to procure information about the enemy as a means to minimize those occurrences, then they are under a pro tanto duty to do so. So to summarize, that's point D on your list here. Insofar as Red are fighting unjust ends, they lack a right that Blue regard their military intelligence as privileged. And in spying on them as a means to further their own just ends, Blue are not violating a right of Reds. Contrastingly, Blue are fighting just ends, they have a right that Reds regard their military intelligence as privileged, and in spying on Blue in pursuit of their unjust ends, Reds would violate the right of Blues. So it's in that sense that there is a symmetry between the spies of enemies at war, and this is compatible with the view that Red are under a duty to spy to, again, as a means, minimize the occurrences on which their soldiers will act unjustly. So it's complicated, it seems to me. There is a sense in which, we have to evaluate differentially the moral status of spies' acts on the basis of the moral status of the ends which they serve, by so fighting. But that doesn't tell us that the spies of unjust belligerents are never entitled to spy, whereas the spies of just belligerents are always entitled, or indeed a duty, to do so. Now, I said towards the beginning of the lecture that when we defend espionage, we must, or at least it seems to me that we must defend two claims separately. The claim that we are entitled to procure information about the enemy, which the enemy would much rather that we not have, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the claim that the means which spies routinely use in order to access such information are morally justified. Now, deception, comes to mind as a means which spies employ. That's why Kant is so outraged at the possibility that belligerents might use spies. Blackmail, manipulation, exploitation come to mind. But it seems to me that treason is particularly interesting in this context. So I want to finish by spending a bit of time on treason. Remember, I postulate for illustrative purposes that red and blue are at war. Reds have unwarrantedly attacked the blues, or they are proposing to conduct their war in wrongful ways. So by stipulation, the blues are fighting justly and are morally justified in acquiring military intelligence which would enable them to thwart red. So here's the question: may red members help blues' war effort by passing on information to blue about red? Standardly, this would be regarded as an act of treason. Now, this is not an academic ivory tower-ish type of question. There are reasons to think that the American, British, and Russian intelligence services have successfully infiltrated ISIS. Now, from what I gather reading the relevant literature, but also from what intelligence officers tell me, what is meant by this is not that, for example, a CIA employee is operating undercover in an ISIS cell somewhere in Syria. What is meant by this is that a CIA agent based in Damascus is running members of ISIS cells, hoping that they will pass on to him important information about the next planned attack. Now, from ISIS' point of view, there is absolutely no doubt that, if those of their members who are helping our intelligence services were to be found out, they would be branded as, treated as traitors. So this means that right now, as we are thinking about this, some members of ISIS are running this risk. They are betraying, on some accounts, their community of origin at enormous risk to themselves. And I think that's why we need to think about this. Now, in order to think about this, we must confront a difficulty. We must come to grips with what we mean by treason. Now, some people take the view that an act of treason is by definition, precisely because it is an act of treason, morally wrong. They endorse a morally laden definition of treason. I don't like morally laden definitions in general. It seems to me that we can't solve those normative questions by definition of fiat. So I propose instead to adopt a morally neutral definition of treason, which would go like this. An agent T commits treason vis-à-vis his leadership L just if it is understood by both T and L that T has undertaken some duty to L, whether or not T does have such a duty. T has led the leadership to believe that he will fulfill the duty, and T defaults. This definition doesn't presuppose that to commit an act, or doesn't assume that to commit an act of treason is by definition morally wrong. It allows for the possibility that treason might, in some cases, be morally justified. And indeed, I want to argue, this is my key claim here, that treason is not always morally wrong. In fact, I want to argue not only that we sometimes are permitted to commit treason, but indeed sometimes are under a duty to do so. And I would like to help us along there. I'd like to imagine two stylized cases involving an agent whom I'm calling Richard. That's in honor and memory of Richard Sorge, who was probably the Soviets' most efficient spy in the years leading up to and during the Second World War. The first case is one I call passive traitor. So I'm assuming that Richard is a high-ranking officer in Red's armed forces, and he knows that if he leaves his computer logged onto the network at a particular time, Blue's services will hack onto the network and successfully download information about Red's forthcoming troop movements. So Richard is passive because all he has to do is leave the computer logged on. As an active traitor, this time Richard is in a position to himself download the secret information in question and to pass it on to Blue's services. How one might defend the claim that Richard is permitted to betray the Reds? Now, he's understood by his leaders to be under a duty to Red. he may indeed have taken an oath, to that effect. However, an oath to assist others in the commission of wrongful killings is not binding morally, nor does his special relationship to his compatriots or fellow soldiers confer duties on Richard to help them commit such killings. Richard, I contend, is not morally obliged to help his side. He is morally justified in not helping them. One cannot say to Richard, "You promised to help us." For ex hypothesis, I remember, by helping the Reds, Richard would help them in commit unjust acts. Now, of course, it doesn't follow from the claim that Richard is morally justified in not helping his side that he is morally justified in helping the other side. Perhaps all that Richard is morally permitted to do is stand by, for example, by resigning from Red's armed forces. And indeed, some people would say precisely that. They would say that, Richard may well indeed be permitted to resign from Red's armed forces as a means to ensure that he will not contribute to those forces' unjust war, but he's not, by dint of his special relationship with his fellow Red members, permitted to help Blue, whether passively or actively. And I want to disagree with that. It seems to me that agents generally are permitted to help save the lives of victims of wrongful lethal attacks, and they're permitted so to help them by killing sometimes those attackers, even when those attackers are on their side nominally. Special relationships between compatriots or members of the same armed forces do not in themselves create duties which override the permission to rescue victims of those wrongful killings. The example that I have in mind here is the example of the My Lai massacre, where an American officer, Hugh Thompson, actually interposed himself between fellow American soldiers who were perpetrating atrocities against Vietnamese civilians and threatened to kill them if they did not desist. As a matter of fact, he did not kill those soldiers because they stopped. But if you believe that he would have been permitted to kill them in defense of civilian victims, if you believe, in other words, that there can sometimes be a permission to kill fellow soldiers in defense of those whom they ought not to kill, then it seems to me that you must accept the view, at least be sympathetic to the view, that they are morally entitled to help those innocent victims by passing on information. If you're morally permitted to kill a compatriot in defense of someone whom your compatriot is about to kill, then surely you are morally entitled to help that victim by, for example, passing on information about your compatriot's cache of arms. Hence, more generally put, the claim that Richard, Red members, might in some cases at any rate be morally permitted to betray their side by passing on information to the enemy. I want to suggest more strongly still that there can sometimes be a duty to commit treason. Let us accept, for the sake of argument, of course, if you don't accept that premise, then you are not going to be on board with the remainder of the claim. But let's accept for the sake of argument that individuals generally owe a duty of assistance to distant strangers, a duty of protection from unwarranted harms. More specifically, let us accept for the sake of argument that we owe a duty to distant strangers to let them access what they need. If I stand between you and the resources which you need in order to defend your life or the life of others, resources moreover, this is crucial, resources moreover which you are justified in obtaining in the first instance, then I am under a pro tanto duty to step aside, to let you get that information, or at least under duty not to remain in your way, and that is exactly what Richard is asked to do in the example of passive traitor. The duty of assistance, or the duty of Good Samaritanism, moreover, includes, it seems to me, a duty actively to help people get what they need and are justified in obtaining. If you cannot get the life-saving resource to which you have a claim without my help, I am under a pretended duty to give it to you. And this is exactly what Richard is asked to do in the case of the active traitor. Now, of course, all of this is subject to cost and due sacrifice related considerations. There is a limit to the costs and sacrifices which one can reasonably expect others, including wrongdoers, it seems to me, to incur on our behalf. And it seems to me that one's causal and moral responsibility for someone's predicament makes a difference to the cost that one may legitimately be expected to bear for the sake of helping that person. So, my view is not that, for example, a member of an ISIS cell is under an unqualified duty, to betray the cell. My view is that, we might take on board the degree to which, that particular individual agent is causally and morally responsible for what the cell might go on to do. Now, I want to illustrate my treason cases to finish, my treason argument to finish with 4 cases. The first 2 are, I think, relatively easy. The last 2 are not. They trouble me greatly. And I wonder what you think about these. So the relatively easy cases are cases where people committed treason. I would call it an act of treason. Remember, treason I define as morally neutral against the Nazis, or indeed against ISIS. So I hope it's not too controversial to say that those agents are morally permitted so to act. Now we need to take various considerations on board, such as collateral harms to third parties resulting from those acts of treason. But I want to at least hold on to the thought that pro tanto, at any rate, those agents were, in the case of the Nazis, are, in the case of ISIS, permitted so to act, in the sense that they would not wrong, those members of the leadership by so doing. Now, here are the not so easy cases, beginning with the Manhattan Project. So, the Americans, during the Second World War, and particularly from 1944 onwards, if my knowledge of the history is correct, gave repeated warnings to the Japanese authorities that unless the latter surrendered unconditionally, their country would face absolute destruction. They did not tell the Japanese that they were developing nuclear weapons with a view to use those nuclear weapons as first strike. Now, here is the question that I'm grappling with. Let's assume counterfactually that had the Japanese authorities known, that fact, they would have surrendered. Well, in fact, they didn't surrender after Hiroshima. I mean, it took 2 bombs, for them to do it. But let's assume that, if they had known that fact, they would have surrendered right away, as they did in the middle of August in 1945. Now, imagine the predicament of someone working for the Manhattan Project. And let's assume that that person would have known that were the Japanese informed of that fact, they would stop the war right away. Well, the question is this. Would it have been morally permissible for that American scientist or military official to, in effect, betray the United States by passing on the information to the Japanese authorities? Now, if you think, you might not think that, but if you think that using nuclear weapons, particularly as a first strike, is morally wrong, as it happens, it's a war crime. But if you think that it is morally wrong, one of the most egregious wrongdoings which can be committed in the course of a war, or indeed outside of war, for that matter, then you might be inclined to think that that American official was actually pro tanto permitted to disclose that information to the Japanese under those counterfactual conditions that the Japanese would have surrendered. Now here's a harder case, and we come back full circle here And I don't know what I think about that case. So I'm going to finish, with a question. We come back full circle because the case involves the 2003, invasion of Iraq by the US-led coalition. Perhaps some of you in the room agree that the war not only was unlawful, but was unjust. Perhaps some of you in the room really think that the US-led coalition should not have invaded Iraq. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that it is the case, that the war of aggression was an unjust war. Well, the question, you will have guessed, is this: would it have been morally permissible on the part of a high-ranking, or indeed low-ranking, but let's say high-ranking, because of the need for access to that information, would it have been morally permissible for a high-ranking member of the US military to pass on detailed information about the invasion plan to Iraqi authorities, as a means to thwart the US-led ex hypothesi unjust US-led invasion to help the Iraqis? I think it's a very difficult case. I find it much harder, perhaps I'm wrong, but I do find it much harder, but I do find it much harder than the other three cases I've mentioned, particularly the case of treason against the Nazis and treason against ISIS. So I'm at a loss. I don't know what I think about this particular case. But it seems to me that if we are at least, and this will be my last point, if we are at least willing to consider the possibilities, first, that this war was an unjust war, at least insofar as it lacked a just cause. Second, that we are morally permitted to help victims of wrongful killings thwart those killings, then we have to at least consider the possibility that there is a sense in which, notice how carefully I'm phrasing this, that we have to be willing to at least consider the possibility that there is a sense in which it might have been permissible treason for a high-ranking member of the US or indeed British military to commit treason by passing on information about the planned invasion to the Iraqis. I end up with that difficult case partly because we have to think about difficult cases. That's how we make progress. But also as a way to bring into salience, I hope, what is so troubling about the issue of espionage. The epistemic dimensions of war are some of the most difficult topics that just war theorists have to grapple with. And I hope that, by way of this lecture this afternoon, even if I have not convinced you, about anything that I've said here, that I have at least, managed to show why there is some value, as we think about ethics in public life in general, why there is some value in thinking about this very specific, particular way in which, or tool which we use when we go to war. Thank you very much. I was told you always ask the first question. And now it's the hardest.
Here, Francis.
That seems to imply I can only ask one question, which is their way of quieting me, actually. First of all, I just wanted a clarification. You always say that you're using a fact-relative sense of permissibility and duty. So let's say, in passive trader, if he actually believes his side is right, that red side is right, do you still think he has a duty to pass on the information or let the system be hacked? A fact-relative duty.
Fact-relatively.
So I believe my side is right, and I just hate my side because of whatever, I was wronged by them or whatever. And then I perform my duty by allowing the espionage, or allowing the information to be captured by the blues. So this is a completely fact-relative sense, even though we think the person is a bad person because he believed otherwise.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can have duties, fulfill duties in that way. I just want to be clear about that. Maybe I misunderstood, but did you say that on page 2 that red mounts and let's say blue has a just cause, but that just cause, you haven't yet determined that you have a just war, you have a just cause,
No, okay,
but they have to ascertain whether the war would breach any of the other requirements, necessity, proportionality, etc. So are you then saying that before you know that you are involved in a just war, just because you have a just cause, you can engage in some spying that the other side couldn't engage in to determine whether your war would be just. I mean, that goes pretty far. You don't yet know that you have a just war.
So I think it's very difficult. So there is a regress problem here, and I haven't yet, with respect to the just cause, I want to say two things. I don't know yet how to solve that problem. So any help you can give me, I would appreciate. So I have to confess that I just don't know how to solve that problem. Now, that's the first point I want to make. I want to go back to regress, but there is a second point I want to make before I forget. So there is a complication to all of this, which I didn't think I would have time to address orally, which is why I didn't, which is that wars are, as some scholars call them, morally heterogeneous. So I think the view that I want to advocate here is that the moral status of one's ends, including one's ends within the war, will have a bearing on the moral status of one's acts of spying, in that war. Set that aside, go back to regress. So the problem here is this. I don't know whether I have a just cause. In order to know whether I have a just cause, I have to go and spy. But of course, it may turn out that I don't have a just cause, so that ex post I will not have been justified, fact relatively, in spying. So I've got as far as to say, well, ex post I will not have been fact relatively justified, in spying. But I still would want to say that. So here's the question now. Was I evidence relative justified, in spying? Well, yes, I may well have been evidence relative, justified, in spying. Indeed, I may well have been evidence under an evidence relative duty, to spy, even though it turns out that fact relatively, I wasn't, justified, in doing it. Go on.
No, well, I just wanted to say that these two questions, or these two parts of one question, have to do with the issue of how much you're pressing fact relativity.
Yes.
But the final point I want to make, if I'm allowed to, is there any duty to avoid spying and see first whether you can acquire the information from information that is already out in the public domain? In other words, is this second best in and of itself because you have a duty to avoid doing it if you can accomplish your end in some other way?
Yeah, good. That's excellent. So you're right. I need to make that point clear. So I don't want to commit myself to the view that you are first under a duty to find out what there is in the public domain before you go and spy, deceive, blackmail, manipulate, and so on. And I don't want to commit myself to this view, for the following reason. It might be very, very lengthy and very costly for you, to wait until you work out what there is available in the public domain, before you go and spy, deceive, and so on and so forth. And it may well, I want to allow for the possibility that you might have to take risks. That if you first look or spend an enormous amount of time looking at what there is available in the public domain, you might deprive yourself of the possibility of saving lives, which would have been saved, if you had not waited that long and used, deceitful, treacherous, manipulative means, first. So let me try and give you, if I may, what might be a fruitful way of thinking about this. So in the context of police enforcement, my understanding is that generally, in order to get a warrant, well, in the wake of the Snowden, revelations, empirically my claim won't be forced, but we might think that, the police ought to present some evidence, to a judge obtained not through means such as wiretapping, in order to get a warrant permitting them, to wiretap. But I can imagine the police saying, well, look, you might think that we don't have enough, that we ought to give you more, but lives are at risk. There. So we want you to give us now, permission, to actually do a wiretap, even though admittedly we could spend another 2 weeks, surveilling, those people without intrusively, listening in onto their conversations. Does that make sense?
Actually, no, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think, morally speaking, I can imagine circumstances where, it really would be very costly. But, we could begin with the cases where holding costs equal,
Oh, I agree. So
But the idea that without presenting any evidence that might be available to you, perhaps easily gotten, let us put that constraint at the beginning, okay? You can just go and ask for permission to...
So my claim is not that, to be very, very precise, my claim is not that I should phrase it in an affirmative way rather than in a negative way. My earlier claim was the following: I do not want to commit myself to the view that we have to exhaust, I didn't put it that way then, I'm putting it now. I don't want to commit myself to the view that we have to exhaust all possibilities as available in the public domain before you look beyond, if you will.
That sounds reasonable.
Right, okay.
Hi. So I also want to ask about the fact relativity commitment. Not that I think there's anything wrong with it. It's a perfectly sensible way of going about it, but it strikes me as rather unhelpful to most circumstances, because in most circumstances what we're interested in is the first personal ex ante point of view, because we want morality to be action guiding. Now again, it's perfectly okay to say that from the ex post omniscient point of view, someone has done something wrong, and maybe that matters for punishment, maybe that matters, as Alec has written about, for third parties who know what the truth is better about whether they should intervene or not. But again, from the first person point of view, it doesn't strike me how it's helpful, and it also makes so many of the things that one might think are puzzling completely unpuzzling. So if the fact of the matter is my side is in the wrong, is fighting an unjust war, then it's not that I should commit treason. It's not that I could, and it's not that you're permitted to spy. The answer should always be baby food, right? That's a rather uncomplicated and unhelpful way of running it. So the spy from the unjust country doesn't have to even go out and spy. Make believe that she made the trip and say baby food, right? If it turns out that she's wrong and her side actually is the right side, the just side, then it was terrible that she just said baby food. And just to end on this, I don't understand, on your view, why your hard cases are hard cases at all. And the fact that you find them to be hard cases, I think, reveals that in your intuitions, there's more going on than your theories suggest. It seems straightforward, on your view, that conditional on the fact of the matter being that dropping the atom bomb is wrong, you should disable the atom bomb. You should have it blow up on U.S. forces if you can arrange that. Again, on your view, if the truth of the matter is that the launching of the Iraq War is an unjust war, of course, high-ranking U.S. officials should be treasonous and try to upend the war. And in fact, even in ways that would cause massive casualties on the U.S. side, if that were the only way to do it. And because you're troubled and you find this to be a hard case, that suggests there's something else going on here that your talk hasn't actually revealed to us.
So, or to myself, even as it happens. So let me explain why I think that there is value, to looking at, fact, relativity. So I suppose, so one reason is local, to the literature, and perhaps I'm too beholden, in that respect, to the literature as it has, developed. But many of the just war theorists, who insist on there being more or less symmetry between combatants, appeal to fact relativity. And so I suppose I want to say, well, let's see what follows, for spies, if those claims, are true. That's, let me.
I actually don't think fact relativity is the only way to get there. You could say that if someone has good reason to think that her side is unjust, then from an evidentiary point of view, she ought not to fight.
Absolutely.
In that war, but you
right.
need fact relativity to get there. You just need to.
Well, so you could argue that there is a sense in which she ought not to fight, but if you also believe that in some cases, at any rate, we are morally obliged, to fight, then there is a sense in which, even though she is evidence relative justified in fighting, she will have been derelict in her fact, relative, moral duty. Now, you may think, well, it doesn't really matter. That's a question of, it's an issue of conceptual bookkeeping, as it were. But in fact, you yourself, suggested that it may well matter, for issues to do with punishment, indeed compensation, reparation, and so on and so forth. Now, there's another point that you said many things. I might not be able to respond, to all of them. But there is another point that I wanted to say to do with we should the Manhattan, project official, should have blown up, the weapons against their own troops. Well, it seems to me that if there are other alternatives, the only way to stop. Well, so I don't know what I think about that. I don't know whether, in effect, redirection, in that case, would be morally, permissible. Now, the heart of your question, which echoes, I think, some of the worries that Francis was articulating, has to do with, tensions between, on the one hand, my espousal of fact relativity, and on the other hand, my description of some of those cases, as being difficult. And I acknowledge, that tension. And your question is helpful because it's helping me, putting pressure on what bothers me so much, about the Iraq, 2003 case. And I think, so what bothers me, I'm beginning to realize, are things which may not have anything to do with, treason, but with difficulties in, engaging in proportionality considerations in such cases. So here is what I might have in mind. Acts of treason, even if they are in some sense in a limited, restricted way, or at least pro tanto justified, might be extraordinarily destructive, of trust between different, armed, forces and so on and so forth. And it seems to me that, these harms or these risks were clearly worth incurring, in the case of, putative treason, against Nazi Germany. But I'm not entirely sure that this is the case, with the 2003, invasion, of Iraq. And so, what I ought to have said, was the following: fact relatively, if it is the case that fact, relatively, the war was unjust in its, multifaceted dimensions. And if it is the case that fact relatively, passing on information to the Iraqis would not have, resulted in harms which would have rendered the act, disproportionate, then fact relatively, there was a permission, to commit, treason. So I think you're right. I think, well, you didn't say that, but I think this is, what I should have, what I should have said. Can I go back? I don't want to take too much time, but I want to go back, to your point. On the degree to which I want to commit myself, or not, to the view that, there is a duty to exhaust, all possibilities as are available, all informational, possibilities as are available, in the public domain before one engages, in acts of espionage. And I still think that I don't want to commit myself, to that view for the reason that I've, indicated, fact, relatively. Does that make so? I'll just, leave it at that.
Thanks, Cécile. I found your account of the ethics of treason largely convincing, but I was kind of wondering why you weren't more convinced yourself, particularly about this Manhattan Project case. So it's a bit of a follow-up to Arthur's question. So you gave an argument for a pro tanto permission for the US, for a US citizen to reveal to the Japanese that the US were developing nuclear weaponry in the Manhattan Project case. But you gave no argument for its prohibition. So I just found it kind of confusing that you found it a difficult case. But maybe I'm just going to throw out a possibility, and that isn't just that it's perhaps counterintuitive that we'd want the US citizen to engage in an act of treason of that kind. I wonder if it's made more complex by the fact that we might think the US cause is just in that war, even if that individual act of,
right, good.
you know.
Yeah, good. So I'm reluctant. It would help me, but nevertheless to go as you suggest. But I'm reluctant to do that, even though it would make my life easier. And I'm reluctant to do that because I see more problems in that proposal. Problems stemming precisely from the point which I made earlier in response to Francis, that it seems to me that we need to look at the moral status of acts of spying in relation to the moral status of the ends, the specific ends which they would serve, or indeed disserve. So look, I'm sympathetic to the view that it would have been morally justified. Well, actually, no, sorry, that's not going to work. So I leave that part of my response, there. I think the reason why I find this case is difficult is, well, perhaps because maybe I spent too much time, reading, empirical accounts, of those kinds of betrayal, which all again and again and again, emphasize how extraordinarily destructive, certainly internally, those acts, of betrayal, can be. And indeed, if we, so let me go with you then, even if we think that, the US had a just cause, overall, against Japan, we ought to be wary, of acts by individual combatants, which, insofar as they would foster destructive, distrust, would vitiate or would have vitiated, the American armed forces' ability, to fight, to bring, that war, to an end. I think also that one of the reasons why I find that example, difficult is, similar to what I've just said to you, that. If you take on board, if you accept that, the Americans, dropped the bomb, partly as a means, as a signaling tool, vis-à-vis the Soviet Union, of whom they knew already that it would be the next, enemy. Well, then, again, this is where proportionality considerations, become quite difficult. And so it may be that my worries, have to do not so much with the act of treason itself, but with the underlying assessment, of the war as just or unjust, which the act of treason, would have been meant to serve.
Just a quick response. I just want to say, in your response, you mentioned that the empirical work shows how destructive it is on the person that commits the act of treason. And I completely agree that might make it not morally obligatory for the person to engage in the treason. But remember, the way you put it in, at least if I remember correctly, it was a pro tanto permission. And it's not clear to me that it's not both permitted and supererogatory for someone to do that, even though it might have that self-destructive impact.
So, yeah, okay, good. So, good. So it could be that the qualifier pro tanto would take care, of the problem, that you're identifying. I'll need to think more, about that. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm afraid I wanted to press the Manhattan Project question as well.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
And again, could you say yet more about why you thought of it as more complicated or unclear than the Nazi or ISIS cases, or indeed the My Lai case in particular, because it looks highly analogous to My Lai. So, just to check I understood, is the idea that if the Japanese are alerted to the threatened bombing, that they would surrender anyway without it being necessary? Why is that like not a no-brainer? I mean, if Thompson's justified in standing in front of the civilians at My Lai and threatening to kill his comrades in arms, why is there any question about what? Sorry, you can see where this is going, so go ahead.
No, that's good. I think you're right to press me on this. Maybe it is a no-brainer. Maybe I should put it in the category of the relatively easy, cases. But I think, I think it goes back, to trust. And, particularly if you think that the US was overall, the just side. I can only repeat, what I said earlier, to Joe, which is, then it worries me, those acts, which, might foster distrust, to such an extent as to, make it very difficult operationally, for the just belligerent to continue to fight. Maybe I'm wrong about this. I mean, I'm very, I'm not. I mean, if in the end, it's a relatively easy case, well then, so be it. It's a relatively, easy case.
But if the Japanese are going to surrender, there isn't an issue, is there, about whether the just belligerent is able to continue to fight?
Oh, but it might be later on. So,
okay.
so I mean, if you look at the great acts, of treason, and betrayal. So, Ames within the CIA, or indeed Robert Hanssen within the FBI, the Cambridge Five, and so on. I mean, the aftershocks, of those acts of treason, were felt for a very long time.
Oh, sure.
Afterwards.
Yeah.
So,
but I mean,
these are the worries.
Right, but
which,
if the immediate motivation of the Cambridge Five had been to certainty that they would be saving hundreds of thousands of people from, uncontroversially innocent people from incineration, it's not clear that then the long-term knock-on effects would be really.
Right, but so in that case, yes, but so we know that cooperation between the British and American intelligence services was extraordinarily difficult, for a number of years actually after the Cambridge Fives, were exposed. So you can imagine a situation where, as a result of a lack of intelligence sharing, for example, between the services, flowing from the fact that the Americans couldn't trust, rightly so, as it happens, the British, hundreds of thousands of lives, were lost. So these are some of the worries, which underpin my classification, if you will, of those cases.
I myself endorse the moral equality of soldiers, so it's been very instructive for me to listen to this thoughtful exposition of the contrary view, which leads to my question. Granting, for the sake of this question, that a combatant who knows that his or her side is unjust ought to desist, I think that the example on which you concentrated, that a treason, emphasizes a distinction. How much of your argument depends on what I ought to do because I know my side is unjust, and how much of it depends on the further assumption that the other side is just? It seemed to me that part of the treason argument is I should help the other side because they are just. And insofar as that's the case, I want to point out that we often say, I think rightly, that in wars at most one side is just.
Good.
And most often, this may be my Middle Eastern context or whatever, it's very often the case, especially on the necessity clause, that both sides are unjust. There's the march of folly, and most wars could have been avoided regardless of which side had the just cause. And insofar as both sides are unjust, which I think is most often the case, then you need to think about whether it's sufficient that my side is unjust to warrant that I ought to be helping the other side who is more or less or equally unjust.
Okay, but this is brilliant. It's good, but what you said at the very end is really, really important. There are three possibilities. You listed three possibilities. The other side is more unjust, they're less unjust, they're equally unjust. Now, there are different views that you could take. You could say the following. You could say, well, all I'm required to do and what I'm permitted to do is to stand aside. I am permitted not in any way to dirty my hands, in this. That's one, possible view. Or you could take the view that if the other side is more unjust than your side, well, you ought not to help them. Or you could take the view that if they are equally unjust, well, actually, that's a difficult one. I need to think about that. But if
epistemically, that's, I think, the most common, because gauging degrees of injustice here is, you need Dante to figure that out.
So can I just park that one, for now, and go to the third, possibility where, the other side is less unjust, than yours. Now, this is interesting because, you might argue, on some views, we are under a duty to minimize evil. And so on that view, you might think, well, even though I would be helping an unjust, side, because they are less unjust and because I'm under a duty to help, minimize evil, I ought, to help them. Now, with respect to the really, difficult, question, i.e., I'm willing to accept, one is willing, imagine someone who has the good sense, you might argue, or the intellectual humility, on the one hand, to say that both sides, are unjust, but who also believes that, they are equally, unjust, then I need to think more, about that. This is the beginning of the project, not the end. I don't have a full answer, but it seems to me that I would want to look at reasons one might invoke, to help one side. And some of those reasons, I think, will be bad or better, reasons than, than others. And so here's a first, well, that might be the last, but here is a first, a point that I would want, or avenue of inquiry that I would want to pursue, in this very, very difficult case. And I don't know what I think about that. I mean, of course, fact relatively, but some of you might think, sorry, I didn't catch your name. But, Arthur, oh yes, I know you are. Yeah, Arthur would be very skeptical of this. I do think that, establishing fact relative justifiability, does matter, if only. Well, so here's one reason why, which I haven't, mentioned before. I mean, I've mentioned reparations, punishment, in line with your own suggestions. But I think here is another reason, which I think is part of, but not entirely the same as, reparations, as to why this kind of moral accounting, if you will, is important, and that has to do with remembrance. I mean, I think that we have strong, moral reasons to remember wars and their actors, that there are moral norms that regulate our practices of remembrance. And, whether or not, some people were, as a matter of fact, whatever they thought at the time, permitted to fight, to kill, to spy or not, really is important, when we engage, in this form of, ex post, if you will, moral, reckoning. But no, thank you for your question.
I will follow up on that just by saying that you've done such interesting work on the topic of war exit. And so I'm wondering whether, and not that you need to answer this now because I'm actually also concluding, but wondering the degree to which your framework for thinking about war exit and the transition to, sort of all things considered, just and stable peace should inform the decision-making of the agent. That is to say, if the agent is oriented towards the question of that transition to exit rather than to the specific action.
I think that's a very good question. So one of the reasons, it's very easy to make fun of Kant, when he rages, against lying and espionage, and so on and so forth. But I think it's too easy, to make fun of him. And in fact, one of the arguments he puts forward against, espionage is directly related, to your question. And in fact, it dovetails with some of my worries about trust. And, his argument is that, espionage will vitiate trusts, between belligerents such that they will not be able to trust one another enough, to conclude, a just peace. So I think that we do, have to, we do have to take that issue, into account as well.
Thank you very much, Cécile, for launching our conversations.
Thank you.